All right, for this morning's lesson, as we continue on our book-by-book series, I want us to start out with this passage. So if you've got your Bibles, go ahead and turn in them to John chapter 19. John 19, we're going to spend a few minutes here to open our lesson from some words from the beloved apostle to kind of set the tone for the message that we're going to be talking about today. John 19, I'm going to start in verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." And everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So Pilate delivered Jesus over to them to be crucified. "Behold your king." This is a statement of great irony coming from Pilate. And I shared this when I did our series about a year ago on my trip to Israel. And I got to see the stone pavement, the judgment seat where Pilate sat when he declared this message. And what's so powerful, and this is one of those questions that may never be answered for me until I get to meet the Lord face to face and ask him in his infinite wisdom, did Pilate know what he was saying? Because when Pilate went up on the judgment seat, that is when the words that he say effectively become law. When Pilate addresses the crowd on many occasions before this event, he is just down among them. He's talking with them. He's talking to them. He's having a conversation. But when he sits on the judgment seat, his words go into effect. And the first words out of his mouth when he sits on the judgment seat, "Behold your king." He declares that Jesus is rightly the king of the Jews. Did he say this out of sarcasm and irony because of the way that the history of Jesus' betrayal and the angry mob that is before him played out? I don't know. Probably Pilate was just being sarcastic with this remark, but in an official capacity, he was recognizing the sovereign truth that Jesus is king. And I share this to start this lesson because Pilate's words ring eternally true. Christ is our king. He is our sovereign Lord. But he does not rule like other kings and other leaders throughout history. See, Jesus, when on his throne, he rules with a servant heart. He leads by sacrificing. He teaches by doing. And he comforts by becoming poor and lowly himself. This was not the king that Israel was expecting. Israel wanted a king that would make them look like other nations. The Pharisees and the Jews, they wanted a king to conquer all of their enemies. Not a king who was going to seek and save the lost. Not a king who was going to love his enemies. Israel wanted a Caesar of their own, but instead, God sent a shepherd. And that is the story of our King, and that is the story of our book for today, 1 Samuel. Behold your King. In this portion of our faith's history, we read about those whom God stood against and those whom God lifted up. And the distinction between those whom he humbled and those whom he exalted is this: the condition of their heart. What did their heart look like? That was the deciding factor of whether God would bring them down to ruin or lift them up to glory. And while at this time of Samuel, Israel is looking for a leader who looks like the world, a leader who would rival that of Egypt's Pharaoh, of the Canaanite king, of the Philistine king. But that's not the leader that God wanted for his people. God wanted a leader who looked like his heart, not like the world. As we get into this lesson, to provide a few historical context for us, when we look at the time of Samuel, it takes place over the course of about 100 years worth of history, from approximately 1105 BC to 1011 BC. It spans the life of the prophet Samuel. And this takes place some 300 years after some 300 years of God having judges rule in the land. And while these judges are appointed as local leaders for the people, their influence is simply insufficient because Israel, as we have learned the past couple weeks, continues to downward spiral in worse and worse sins, committing all degree of atrocity, chief of which was rape and murder and child sacrifice. And though, as we saw last week with our study in Ruth, and we'll see again today, there were always individual families and persons that maintained their loyalty and obedience to God, as a people group on the whole, Samuel was born into one of the darkest times of God's people. And during this time, while Israel continues to go through their downfall, their enemies are gaining ground. The Philistine army is at its strongest in a long time. The Amalekites begin attacking. Various Canaanite remnants that Israel was supposed to get rid of, because they failed in fulfilling God's command, the Canaanites are gaining strength again and are beginning to attack throughout the land. This is what Samuel has to face. And the main theme that we'll see in this text as we go is that we need to take note of how God works both through people who were faithful and people who were weak. Throughout this book, if you were to go through and read on your own, the thought that I want to challenge you with is this main theme. Look for the contrast between those who are weak and those who are faithful, and how God uses each one to accomplish his purposes. We'll see in this text the faith of Hannah, the faith of Samuel, the faith of David stands in stark contrast to the weaknesses of Peninnah, Eli, and Saul. But whether in faith or in weakness, God always provided the answer to Israel's problems. And he does this by opposing those who are proud and lifting up those who are faithful. So today, instead of having a lessons for today slide at the end, I've just incorporated those lessons as we go throughout the text. So as we do our summary of content, there's 3 general divisions for 1 Samuel, and each one can be thought of as focusing on as a different person. And the 3 main characters, if you will, for the text are Samuel, Saul, and David. And as we go through the text, what we will see is the rise and fall that occurs during the lives of each of these men. So, that being said, let's start with the first section of 1 Samuel, being that of Samuel himself. The rise and fall of Samuel spans from chapters 1 through 8. In the first opening chapters of this text, we learn of Samuel's origin story, the loving faithfulness of his parents, especially that of his mother Hannah. And it's here where Hannah is unable to have children. Because of this, she becomes the subject of great mocking and ridicule. She is made fun of by others, even in her own family, because she's unable to have a child. As you can imagine, she's extraordinarily heartbroken and upset and plagued by this. She wants nothing more than to have a child of her own. And her loving husband does his best to comfort her, but a husband, in her eyes, is no replacement for a child. And so she prays to God. And God hears her prayer and blesses her with a son, who she names Samuel. The name Samuel means God hears, because he heard Hannah's prayer. And after having Samuel, she dedicates her son to God by taking him to serve in the tabernacle at Shiloh, where I got to help excavate, which is really cool, under the mentorship of the acting priest and judge of the time, the priest Eli. And when she takes him to the tabernacle, she prays this great prayer of how God brings down the proud and lifts up the lowly. I'm going to read verses 3 through 5 of chapter 2. Chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. By Yahweh, actions are judged. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who are full have now hired themselves out for bread, and those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. And the prayer goes on with this theme of God strengthening the weak and bringing down the proud and the strong. And Hannah saw herself in this prayer. But it reflects the nature of everything that will unfold for her son's life and the future of Israel. And we see how true Hannah's prayer is in the very next section of her son's life. In chapters 2 through 4, the priestly family that Samuel goes to learn how to serve God under becomes corrupt. Eli's two sons that are serving as priests in the tabernacle, they abuse their position of authority and influence by using their role as a priest to unlawfully obtain both food and women. And they belittle the Ark of the Covenant into treating it like it is a battlefield mascot that they can just carry with them to fight against the Philistines. And it's kind of one of those things like if you've ever filled out an NCAA bracket for basketball and you have nothing, and you know nothing about basketball, so you just pick the team with the best, mascot, like, oh, man, I love the Battlehawks. I don't even know if that's a team. I just kind of made that up. It's like, that sounds really cool. They're going to lead me to victory because they got the coolest mascot. This is how Eli's sons begin treating the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to take this out on the battlefield because it's going to make the Philistines afraid of us. But their violation of God's law left them fighting alone without God's help. And they lost this great battle. 30,000 Israelites die, including Eli's sons. And Eli himself is punished by God because he failed to properly discipline his sons and prevent them from corrupting others. And so the priestly family of Eli is brought down, while the young Samuel is lifted up by God to serve as Israel's priest, as their prophet, and as the judge over all Israel. Samuel would not be a local regional judge, but he is to be a judge over all of Israel. Which leads us to the way that he rules. Under Samuel's rule, we see that while the Philistines had the Ark of the Covenant captured, God fights back. And I'm not going to get into the whole story here for sake of time, but in chapters 5 and 6, we see this incredible story of how the Philistines capture the Ark. And they put it next to their own idol dedicated to the false god Dagon. And through the power of God's Spirit, this idol dedicated to Dagon begins bowing down in worship to the ark, to God. And God inflicts a plague upon the Philistines, and the plague doesn't relent until they return the ark to the Israelites. But in chapter 7 specifically, we see that Samuel is the ideal judge. He leads with a devout faith in God, which results in Israel abandoning all of their own idols that they had been worshiping, the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Samuel encourages them to abandon the idols and return to a faith in Yahweh. And this is my personal opinion. Feel free to disagree with me. But I believe it's a great shame in our modern culture how we so much glorify judges like Ehud and Samson because of their mighty battles, and they make for these just fantastic scenes of victory and fighting. And yet each of those judges had their own faults. But when you read through the text, Samuel was the pinnacle of all the judges. He did not lead the people in a mighty military victory a single time himself. But what he did do was he led the people back to faith in God. And that is of far greater value. But as Samuel ages, he attempts to pass down his role as judge and priest to his own sons, but they too become corrupt. They pervert justice by taking bribes and ruling to oppress the poor. And now, there's no indication whatsoever that Samuel was a bad parent. We are told explicitly that Eli failed as a father on a number of occasions, but we see no indication from the text whatsoever that Samuel failed. The impression is given that Samuel always lived as a good man and a faithful father. So unlike Eli, Samuel did not fail his sons, but his sons still failed God. And their failure leads to Israel desiring a king to rule over them. And so, as I said, we're going to talk about a couple key lessons as we go through this summary of content. And one of the lessons that we really need to take to heart from Samuel is that we need to trust God with our children. And I have Amber to thank for this next point, who she must be in the back right now. But a few days ago, she shared this post on Facebook that was from an anonymous writer. So I can't really source it. It was written anonymously. But when I read this post, and I'm going to share the first half of it with you in just a moment, I thought, wow, that describes what happens between Hannah and Samuel so perfectly. And so this post that Amber shared, it reads like this. It says, "Don't feel sorry for or fear for your kids and your grandkids because the world they are going to grow up in is not what it used to be. God created them and called them for the exact moment in time that they are in. Their life wasn't a coincidence or an accident. Raise them up to know the power they walk in as children of God. Train them up in the authority of His Word. Teach them to walk in faith, knowing that God is in control. Empower them to know they can change the world. Don't teach your children to be fearful and disheartened by the state of the world, but hopeful that they can do something about it." And with Samuel, we see that it was God that had prevented Hannah from having a child all those years, up until the time when he knew Samuel was needed. And once Samuel was born, Hannah did everything in her ability as a loving mother to ensure that Samuel remained faithful. And none of us choose when we come into this world, and none of us even choose the families that we come into this world with. But we can trust that God knows the positive impact that each of us can have. And the same goes for our children. And I share the same concern as many of you for what the future may hold in the world around us for my own kids. But that's not something that we're ever told to do. We're never told to fear anything in this world. Scripture teaches us to prepare our children for the world, not to be afraid of it. That is a gift from God. The gift of the responsibility to teach, to train, to discipline, and to prepare our children to be a force for good in this world that increasingly can't even recognize good. And I know that we're talking about Samuel at the moment, but I'll put it this way. David fearlessly and faithfully defeated Goliath because he was raised to be a man of courage. Now, the second lesson that I challenge us to take from Samuel in this portion of the text comes when the people plead for a king and no longer want to live under Samuel as judge. And Samuel's very upset by this. He is distraught and disappointed. But God's comfort to Samuel are these words: "They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as king." This reminds me of Jesus' own words, that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me first. How many times do we need this reminder in our lives today? And I will say that I think that the more that we live out our faith, the more that we need this exact reminder. Knowing that when you stand up for truth, when you stand firm in the faith, when you tell others of their need to repent of sin, when you encourage and teach others of God's salvation and love for them, and you are rejected for it, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting God. And that fear of rejection is one of the greatest hindrances to evangelism and to publicly defending the faith, because we take this rejection personal. It makes it feel like we're the one that failed. We're the one that's insufficient. Well, I tried sharing my faith with this person and they turned me down. I guess I'm not good enough. That is never how we're taught to respond to the truth. We're taught that they did not reject you. They rejected God. We actually get the blessing of being the messenger who brings good news to people. It is as if we have been given the cure to AIDS or to cancer or to COVID-19. We've been given the cure, and we can go out to all of our loved ones who are suffering these afflictions, and we get to give it to them. But then we decide not to, because but maybe they won't take the medicine, so I won't even try. We get the blessing of having the cure. Whether others take it or not is on them. And their rejection is not against you, but against God. And that brings us to the king that is first appointed after the people's pleading. So now we're going to turn to the second portion of this text, and that is the rise and fall of King Saul, occurring between chapters 9 through 15. And we see the beginnings of Saul's kingship. Chapters 9 and 10, God chooses Saul to be the king of Israel, and he charges Saul with the explicit purpose to restrain the people. Saul isn't put in charge by God to lead the people forward. He's given the mission by God, bring the people back. When they go on their own, they mess it up. Bring them back to my word. Saul's duty as king was one thing: restrain the people from doing what is right in their own eyes. Bring them back to my word. Now, there's one thing that's easy to overlook as you read through the book of Samuel, and that's this. God clearly chose Saul because Saul could have been a great king. However, there are early signs, even in his initial calling, that he would falter in his faith. We see that when we first meet Saul, he, like David, is a shepherd. But unlike David, Saul has lost his flock. Saul's goats are missing. The one thing that he's in charge of leading, and he failed them. And when Samuel is about to announce Saul as the king to all of Israel, Saul is hiding because he is afraid. And then when the people see him and he's brought out before them, the people respond in awe at how large and mighty of a man he is. Everything about Saul is about his physical appearance. It was never about his faith. But anyway, let's move forward in his life, because in chapter 11 we see that his kingship does start out well. He gets a very quick and mighty successful victory over their enemy, the Ammonites, but the victory parade is short-lived because Samuel brings them back to reality, and he gives this speech of sobriety to the people that they better not forget that it was God who led them And that's exactly what Saul does in the next few chapters. In chapters 13 through 15, let me get them up there, we see Saul's rapid decline as a leader. The first failure of his is that he offers an unauthorized sacrifice to God. Now he offers this sacrifice hoping that if he brings an extra sacrifice, God will provide an extra blessing. And Samuel immediately scolds Saul for this because Saul offered what was not authorized and what was not commanded. And because of this, Saul is punished that he will not have a dynasty. He will continue to be king for now, but his family lineage will not be the heirs of the kingdom. The second great mistake of Saul is that he makes a foolish vow. And he says that when we're going out to battle, my soldiers will not eat a single crumb until victory is ours. And the person who eats anything will die. Well, somebody didn't get that message. And that somebody was his son Jonathan, who while his father is cowering away, afraid of the battlefield, Jonathan was leading a contingent of troops against their enemies and fighting courageously. And when Jonathan returns from battle, he enjoys a little tasty treat of some honey. And because of this, Saul seeks to put his own son to death. And it's only because Jonathan's courage and bravery won him great favor with the people that the people of Israel step up and prevent Saul from killing his son. And then the third great failure of Saul's is that after Israel has a victory over the Amalekites, Saul takes the spoils. He takes a victory prize for himself. He takes the best of the Amalekite livestock after God commanded him, don't take anything from them. And so when Samuel confronts Saul about this, Saul gives the excuse, but it wasn't for me. I was going to offer these sacrifices to God. And we have a powerful response from Samuel. And that's going to be our primary key lesson from Saul's life. When Samuel is trying to correct Saul, and Saul gives this excuse, yeah, but Samuel, don't you see? I took the best of the livestock, the best of the cattle, the best of the sheep, the best of the goats, because I wanted to dedicate them to God. And Samuel responds, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as he does in obeying his voice? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and to listen is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as bad as the sin of divination. Presuming to know God's will is as bad as idolatry. Because you have rejected God's word, he rejects you as king. This may be one of the most important lessons in all of the book of Samuel, if not in all of the Old Testament. We must avoid checklist religion at all costs. When we reduce our faith down to, I did my morning prayer like I'm supposed to, I did my daily reading like I'm supposed to, and I went to church like I'm supposed to, so I'm good with God. It doesn't matter what else I do there with the rest of my life. That is about the worst kind of faith you can have, because you're merely trying to satisfy a list, and you're not trying to serve God with your whole heart. This is the same sin that Jesus criticizes the Pharisees, because, they bring their great sacrifices to God, they bring their tithes and their spices, but they neglected the weightier matters of doing justice and mercy. And this is one of the great problems with a number of those in the denominational world. Specifically, I can think of the Catholic Church as being one that is very guilty of this. There's this mindset that, as long as I go to my weekly Mass and confess my sins to the priest, God doesn't care what I do with the rest of my life. I went to Mass today, so I'm good. That's not faith. That is reducing religion to a checklist of a works-based salvation. This is what Saul is criticized for. This is what Saul is relieved of his duty as king for doing. We need to make sure that our faith is that which seeks to obey God, more than offering things that he did not ask of us. But because of Saul's failures, that brings us to our last portion of the text today. And that is the rise of David. It takes place through the rest of 1 Samuel, and we'll get through it briefly because I'm now noticing that we're getting pretty low on time. But in chapter 16, David is anointed as king. We have David as this young shepherd boy. And in chapter 17, we have the famous, it's one of my favorite Bible stories, as I'm sure it's probably many of yours, where David defeats Goliath. And the only thing that I'll call to your attention here, because I'm sure you're familiar with the way that he defeats Goliath, is this. David never once, when he goes into the Israel headquarters, when he's talking with King Saul, when he's talking with the other soldiers, when he's talking with Goliath himself, David never once says, hey, guess what? God anointed me as king now. You better listen to me. David exercised great humility. He went to that battlefield with faith in God, not faith in his title as the next king. That's a powerful, powerful lesson in the value of humility and why God chose David to be the leader. And then for most of the rest of the book, we see this David becomes a Robin Hood type figure of Israel. After David's courageous victory over Goliath, Saul becomes desperately jealous of the people's love for David. As such, Saul appoints David as a general and sends him out into many battles, but he does so because he hopes that David will die on the battlefield. Saul is jealous of the favor that David has with God and with the people. So when that plan fails, Saul convinces many of the people and many of the soldiers to turn against David, to try to kill him. And it's at this point that David kind of goes rogue and becomes this Robin Hood-like figure. He travels throughout the countryside of Israel. He puts together this ragtag team, this band of soldiers who are resisting the tyranny of Saul. He begins rescuing many of the rural Israelite villages from their Canaanite conquerors who have been plaguing them over the years and Saul failed to take care of. And the more that Saul pursues David, the more opportunities David has to help others. And in the last two chapters of the text, we see a great contrast between the way that David loves his neighbor and his enemy and the way that Saul was filled with nothing but bitter jealousy all the way to the end of his life. On many occasions throughout the text, David had the opportunity to kill Saul but extended mercy. And that practice of extending mercy works in his favor as he shows mercy to an Amalekite soldier that was nearly dead from starvation and lack of water. And David gives him food and drink. Though this man played a part in kidnapping Israelite women and children, David shows him mercy. And in response, that man betrays his own allegiance to the Amalekites and reveals their location so that David can go out and rescue his wives, rescue his children, rescue many others that were taken captive. While David is leading that rescue mission, the Philistines attack Saul's camp. And Saul's just jealous rivalry for David leaves him just bitter and blind to the way that many of the nations around and many of his own people have turned against him. And God himself has left him. And Saul and his sons die in battle. And that's the cliffhanger that 1 Samuel ends on. There is no king on the throne. He's up rescuing a village of hostages. What lessons can we take from David? Well, more than I could fit into a whole month worth of sermons, but just a couple to consider as we close this morning. And the first is this: God sees the heart. This is the reason that David was chosen. When Samuel goes to the family of Jesse, David, the youngest of his brothers, the smallest of his brothers, his oldest brothers being big burly soldier type men, that Samuel assumes this must be the king that God chooses. But God tells Samuel, don't look at the outward appearance, look at the man's heart. because I see what's on the inside. This is a timeless lesson, especially in our social media, Instagram-driven culture today. Your appearance is not a measure of your value or your potential. God can do many great things in your life, and not a single one of those good things is based on how attractive you are, how physically strong you are, how tall you are. Any of these things that our society values as being the pinnacle of womanhood or the pinnacle of masculinity, none of them matter to God. What matters to God is that do you have a heart that will live for Him? And the second lesson that we see from David is that faith is our greatest weapon. When David goes out onto the field to confront Goliath, David responds to Goliath's taunts. And David says, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh." It wasn't the sling. It wasn't the stones. It was his faith in God. This is the approach that we need to take in life. That the greatest, I hate to even say the word tool in this context, but our greatest asset is not any material weapon, any material tool, any material worth. Our greatest weapon in life that will help us succeed and be victorious in all the battles that truly matter is our faith. We need to lead with that everywhere we go. And the last lesson for today, this links back to the lesson from Samuel, is that we need to trust in God. Yes, we trust Him with our children, as we've already talked about, but we need to trust Him with the trials that we face. David's faith was built up over the years because God had already helped David face the lions and face the bears, and then he faces the giants, and then he faces a nation turned against him. David spent approximately 10 years living on the run from Saul. Yet it's during those years that he gained many trusted personal friends, that he made many political allies, that he learned in terms of combat and what it means to help the helpless. It's during this time that David writes many of the Psalms that we have in our books. It's during this time that David develops mentally and spiritually into the mature man that God needed to be on the throne. And the point is this: one of the hardest things to do in this life is to heed the words of James in the first chapter, to count our trials as joy, because we can trust that through them, God is making our faith stronger. What that looks like for you individually, I can't tell you because we all go through different trials and hardships. But what I can tell you is we can look to Scripture about how God took the trials that people of faith faced and always brought them out stronger because of them. And that is something that we can trust in. And that is where we'll close with 1 Samuel, which I've subtitled, Behold Your King. In 1 Samuel, we have the announcement of the King of Israel, but we see this great contrast between the first king who abandons his faith in God and turns to a life of wickedness, and who would be known even today as the great king of Israel, David, a man after God's own heart. A man whose throne on which God sets his Son to reign not just over Israel, but to reign over all nations for all time, over all the earth, and that is our King, Jesus. Jesus, a king who does not look like the world. Jesus, the King who wants each of us to have righteous hearts. That is our challenge as we close this lesson. Do you recognize Jesus as your King? Have you turned to Him in faithful obedience to His words of guidance, of correction, but also of comfort and encouragement? We know that salvation is promised to all those who have been baptized into him for forgiveness of sins, and those that walk faithfully with him. If there's anybody here this morning that needs the support and encouragement from the church to help you in that walk, we ask that you would let us know before you leave, if not even together now as we stand and sing.